Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from in the world. My name is Peter Loewen. I'm the director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto, and I'm very pleased to welcome you to this conversation on inequalities around the globe. This is a joint presentation of the Munk School, of CEVIPOF at Sciences Po in Paris, and of Ipsos, which of course is a Paris-based company, but has a huge presence here in Toronto. And we're joined by the CEO of Ipsos Global Affairs, Darrell Bricker, and we're joined from Sciences Po by Patrick Le Bihan, who is an assistant professor at Sciences Po. Previously to Sciences Po, he was at the Institute for Advanced Study in Toulouse and has a PhD from New York University. We're going to be talking about inequalities around the globe, and what will happen in this conversation is that Darrell Bricker will present data from the Ipsos Global Advisor project, which is a monthly survey of more than 24 countries around the globe, which gives a genuine global snapshot of what's happening on every inhabited continent on this planet. And then Patrick and I will join him in conversation. So Darrell, it's really our pleasure to have you back here. I really love having these conversations about these big issues. I just want to turn it over to you to tell us what you're seeing in your Ipsos data about concerns about different types of inequality around the globe. And Patrick, you and I can then join in a conversation. So Darrell, that's over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And just to remind everybody on the who's watching today, all of the data that I'm going to be talking about in this conversation are all available or will be available at the Munk School, Ipsos has donated all of our global advisor data, which is our monthly global poll, to Munk. So it's there for scholars to use or for others to take a look at if they're interested. So on the question of inequality, struggles over inequality have basically defined human history. There's always been struggles over economic power, over resources. You can even go back, you don't even have to say history, you can say prehistory. There were struggles over the same thing. So it's not a new topic. But since the late 19th century in particular, the mid 19th century, most of this conversation about inequality has really been about class. It's about who has what and who doesn't have what. And really the battle was really over economic distribution. I mean, that's what Marx was writing about. And his work really defined, I would say, till fairly recently, the types of inequality that people are really focused on, which were basically related to class. Through the course of the 20th century, and I would say into the 21st century, what's been happening is that the definition of inequality has expanded. So we've gone from just looking at it as who has and who has not, but we're starting to look at it over a wider series of topics and issues. And some of these are universal and some of them are very local. So for example, from a universal perspective, we still look at who has and who has not in terms of wealth, but we also increasingly look at power, who has power and who doesn't. Gender is part of this conversation that tends to be universal, but so is the idea that there's an elite, an economic or political elite, which has become entrenched in global institutions, but also in local institutions that are really making more of the decisions about the world today. Whether that's true or not is not really the question. It's what's the perception? What do people think in terms of public opinion? In terms of the local inequalities, they generally in terms of religion, race, ethnicity, whether a person was a native born person in a country or a person comes from somewhere else and is an immigrant. And in some countries, things like, for example, caste. So these are fairly universal topics, but they have their own local character in many instances. What I'm going to argue today, I'm going to put on the table for discussion by Peter and Patrick, is a view that I have, which is that I think that what we're seeing as we move into the 21st century is the emergence based on this expanded set of views of what is equal or unequal in the world, the emergence of something I like to call nativist populism. And whether or not it's really starting to emerge as a global ideology. And nativist populism is really a response to universal liberalism and the expansion of the equality debate. It's a pushback. So will this emerging ideology, this politically defining force of nativist populism, will it continue to build as we go through the 21st century? I think there's some evidence that to make the case that it is. And another question to put on the table for a discussion with Patrick and Peter is whether or not the leaders who've come to define this native populism, are they creating it, or are they simply surfing a wave in terms of public opinion? I would submit to you that they're surfing a wave in terms of public opinion and social change and things that are happening in the world. They've discovered something, they've amplified it, but they haven't created it. So when you look at the various countries in the world, where do we see this native populist sentiment as the strongest? It tends to be in Latin America, in the old Eastern Bloc countries, which is where we're seeing it grow. There's some other places, for example, Turkey and South Africa, where we see that there's a huge nativist part to this, which is really a reaction to immigration or population change that's very strong in places like Turkey and South Africa. And in some countries, we can also see this nativist sentiment pop up a bit more. It's less about that than it is about elitism to a certain extent. So Latin America, former East Bloc, but then you get into the middle tier of countries where we're also seeing this build in the US, Italy, France, and Japan. And then at the bottom of the list, we tend to see countries in which nativist populism really hasn't erupted to the same level or to the same degree, places like Canada and Sweden and countries of that nature. So this is what we're seeing in terms of the emergence of public opinion. As I said before, I submit that there is this growing ideology called nativist populism that's starting to become a real political factor in the world, and that it is something that it's emerging from public opinion that's being found by leaders and exacerbated for the purposes of political calculation. Anyway, Peter, why don't I turn it back to you? You're on mute.
Indeed, I am. Thanks very much for that, Darrell. I'm going to turn it over to Patrick in a second here. Patrick, if you want to make some general comments or respond to that directly, but I've got some questions in response to your questions, Darrell. But Patrick, over to you first.
Okay, so there's several. So now I'm not a specialist of that literature to start, as a point of reference. But having read a few things about inequality, one thing that I notice and that people tend to forget when they discuss inequality in general and studies of perception of inequality in general is that you don't have equality on one side and inequality on another. When you think in terms of economic inequality, you can have some level of economic inequality on some dimension. By giving equality on that dimension, you create inequality on other dimensions economically, right? And there usually is not as much discussion as one would think of how different measures of economic inequality go in different directions. So here's one example. So Piketty in his book had data showing that economic inequality in South Africa was going down after the Second World War at a point in time where apartheid was getting stricter. So you have essentially, on some dimension, economic inequality is getting much stricter because apartheid rules are becoming stricter. But at the same time, if you look at wealth inequality, just looking at the top 1%, you actually have a decrease in economic inequality, okay? And so there's this thing that is a bit problematic often in many of these papers, is that these different dimensions that go in different directions are not necessarily taken into account. And so it's not obvious when you study the perception, for example, of the subjects, what part of the inequality are they actually looking at, right? Because you might have one measure saying inequality is going up, but at the very same time, inequality is going down on another dimension, and different people might be perceiving different aspects of that shift, right? So that's one aspect. And so I don't know how much and how someone would tackle that, but I feel like it's not tackled enough, okay, in those studies. The second part is, I'm French, but I'm also German. And nativist populism, it has a ring to it when you're German historically, right? And so here's one thing that most people tend to forget about the Nazis, but which I find fascinating and something one should think about, is that National Socialist ideology was extremely based on inequalities, but there was an ideal of equality between Germans, okay? So again, going to that first point, there's something weird there, essentially, is that there was a goal of equality there that was being pushed and that was important. It's just that equality between whom was the metric that was being changed, right? And so in some sense it was, to have equality, you need to have a single race. That was the point of the Nazis. Whereas for the Marxists, the claim was, to have equality, you have to have a single class. So they were shifting which group that was, right? And so the question I have, not being a specialist of nativist populism versus liberal universalism, it's still, to what extent the difference there is not inequality versus equality tolerance, but a perception of the fact of between whom should the equality be maximized, right? That would be, those would be some questions I have as someone who's not a specialist of that research.
Those are great questions. I want to build on them, Darrell. Let me put a couple of questions back to you, Darrell, on this in some sense. So, and this really does build on exactly what Patrick has just said. You know, you've observed that there are politicians who are kind of tapping this vein of concern over inequality, and, you know, more broadly, I think, Darrell, like concern over social change and the rates of change, and concern about uncertainty of the future on the one hand, and a sense of nostalgia for the past on the other. And it's always that mix, right, of uncertainty and nostalgia that underwrites a lot of nativist populist claims. But what I might submit to you is that it seems to me that it is true that inequality is important to these claims, but these, and this goes to Patrick's point, these politicians are not playing off objectives, so to speak, right? It's not the case that they are, that they require objective data on which to make their claims, right? In many cases, they're making it on a sense of something that might be reflected in objective data, but it's about people's it's about their perceptions, actually, as much as it is about anything. So I wonder, kind of, what's the inequality that they're playing off of, Darrell, and is it the same across all these countries, or are they pointing to different things when they're making these nativist populist claims? And then the second part of the question, which I'd love to hear your reflections on, and it might be the case that this is the same in every country where these claims are being made, or it's different in each of them, but how much of the kind of nativist populist appeal is actually rooted in senses of fairness? That what these politicians are saying is, you know, the way people in this country are being treated is unfair, right? That big corporate elites are getting ahead and the little guy's not able to succeed, or this new group to the country is getting ahead and people who've been here for a long time are not able to succeed. It's a way of saying how much of these claims are actually rooted in an appeal to inequality, inequality towards the native group in a country, for example. So kind of two questions there, right? I mean, one is, are they making the same claims everywhere? And how many of these claims actually borrow the language of inequality or fairness?
So three parts to that. So I would say that the question about actual inequality versus perception of inequality, immaterial. It's the perception that really matters.
Right.
And it's the perception.
The facts are immaterial. Yeah,
the facts are immaterial. So what I'm sure, you know, Thomas Piketty would have a really good time going and explaining to people in South Africa how apartheid made them more equal. I mean, they're factual things that, you know, they're interesting whatabouts or interesting counterintuitive points, but they don't really play in this conversation. It's people have a very certain view about who's on top and who's not if they're animated by nativist populism. So I think the first point is that it really is about perceptions and what people are feeling. And as you know, in terms of public opinion, that's what goes deep. It's not a true or false test when you go on a questionnaire and you talk to people. It's what they believe, whether it's accurate or not, and what they're responding to at the moment is what they feel, and that's what's the biggest driver behind it. Makes it so powerful because it is driven by emotions, which is far more powerful than facts in terms of motivating public opinion, I would say. Perception of fairness. It's one of those where you sit is where you, or where you stand is where you sit, or whatever. There's a belief and we saw it in the most recent, just to give a contemporary example, the most recent example of the trucker protests in Canada, or we can go to France and look at the Gilets jaunes in France, or we can look at people who are anti-mask / anti-vax and people in other places. They believe that there's a certain elite that's making decisions about their lives in a way that works against them. Now, sometimes it's on behalf of certain other parts of the population, or more particularly, I think what we're seeing these days, it's on behalf of themselves. So there's this idea that there's an elite that doesn't suffer the same way that other people are suffering and doesn't go through the same things that other people go through. They receive disproportionate rewards from the global economy, from the public policy process, from whatever you want to look at. But there's this group of out and in that animates this discussion. So that's a big part of the populist element of this. And then finally, ultimately, it's about power. It's what people say, for example, real Canadians should want, or real Americans should want, or real people in France should want, and why aren't they listened to more? So the politicians know how to animate that, who are working this vein in terms of public opinion. So there's that element of people who are really invested in the country and are more worthy because of their investment, that they should be getting something, just that they're being discriminated against in some way by this powerful elite. So it's something that's existed always, I would think, through time. But what we're seeing is it's this consistent pattern of things that keeps popping up in multiple countries around the world, which we now have the capability of actually measuring. It has its own local character, but the fundamental elements are basically the same everywhere you go.
Should I? Sorry.
Oh, we lost Peter. Do you want to go ahead, Patrick? Go ahead.
Yeah, so here's one thing that I wonder though. So you said it's facts do not matter, but it's mostly perceptions. Okay, so I really believe that perceptions play a big role, but I think that some of these questions indeed have been there for a very long time, but it's not like there's no variation over time of the extent to which they manifest, right? And clearly over the last 10 years, some of these aspects have been manifesting in a much stronger way, right?
Yes.
And so if it's just perception, I still have some difficulty figuring out, well, why are these perceptions all of a sudden that much stronger now, right? And so here's what I wonder. I still believe that something that we may actually not be capturing that well potentially has changed factually in the lives of these people, so that the perception shifts and their emotions, it gets, strong emotional reactions to some aspects. Now, there could be two types of explanation. One explanation is simply, it's going to be social media that is, extending the emotional aspect irrespective of the actual facts, right? Or there are some facts that maybe we're not capturing that well, that actually lead to that shift of perception nonetheless, right? And which would be going against your first claim. And so my question too, essentially, if it's really just perception, why that big shift over the last 10 years? How do you understand that?
No, I'm actually, I wouldn't disagree with that. There are, countless studies that show about the expansion of inequality between, particularly the top elements of the corporate elite and global corporate elite, and what's happening within most countries in terms of working class people or middle class people. There's no doubt about that. The point I'm trying to make is that if somebody comes back and says, well, you're not as poorly off as you think, that factual argument, it's like throwing a ball bearing at a wall of rubber. It just bounces off. There's no effect. So yes, I don't disagree that there are factual elements in some cases that are underscoring why this is happening. Say, for example, anti-immigration views in the United States based on what's happened in terms of Hispanic immigration over the space of the last 30 years. Have we seen a big ramp up in terms of immigration at the, particularly irregular immigration at the southern border in the United States? We absolutely have. So is the nativist reaction in the United States, which was a big part of the reason that Donald Trump got elected, was that a factor or driven by facts, yes, there might be some elements there, but to turn around and tell people it's not as bad as you think doesn't really seem to have any effect on how people relate to it. And the most recent example we have in this country, because we're probably mostly Canadians on this call, is the trucker protest that took place in front of Parliament Hill, in which everybody was telling them that vaccinations are good. 90% of truckers have been vaccinated. You should be, wearing your masks because this is the way that we're going to get out of it. Didn't seem to matter to them, because there was this whole package of things that related to this sense that there was this group of people who were telling them how to live their lives in all aspects that needed to be protested against. So I think that's kind of what we're facing. It's a very emotional kind of thing, but I don't disagree with you, Patrick, that there are some factual factors here that are setting up the emotions to be particularly explosive. I think that's true.
So I want to follow on this in terms of from the politician side of it, because I still don't think we have an answer, and that's not to say that you haven't answered it, Darrell, but I still don't think we have an answer to the degree to which this is really the same phenomenon in every country on the demand side, like in terms of what's going on as people are perceiving inequality and where they think the problems are. And we don't know whether it's universal on the supply side. So one distinction is the following, is that we've got countries like Canada where there really isn't a successful populist party on offer. The People's Party got 4 or 5% of the vote, but 2 elections in a row, they can't make a breakthrough, right? Britain similarly has missed, there hasn't been a populist right party that's been able to break into parliament of any meaning. France is an open question right now. I think we know how the presidential election will go, but the left has been displaced by a new party in the center and by candidates of the far right in this presidential election. So we've got some countries where there's no response at all. We've got where there's no political offering really effectively. We've got other countries where there's populist right parties, and other countries where there's also parties of the populist left. Spain, for example, right, where we've got a response which is much more rooted in perhaps less in middle class grievance and more in cultural grievance about capture by elites in society. So I wonder if you could just speak to, what do you in countries where there is a populist left option, right, where that's kind of broken through, do you have any sense of what's different in those places? Are perceptions of inequality different? Are people's experiences of inequality different? Or is it just that something has allowed those parties of the populist left to break through where they couldn't break through in other places?
I think that the sentiment is not left or right. I think the political entrepreneurs who've decided that they want to go in that direction tend to be more of the right. But the sentiment is equally accessible to the left or right, I would say, because a big part of this is anti-elitism. And so Mexico is a great example with Obrador. I mean, supposed to be a politician of the left, but is he really? I mean, how much different is he than Bolsonaro? They're basically have the same kind of approach to the sense of, I'm a person who's going to open up this system and make things work for the little guy, the person who's being discriminated against. Now, the character of that discrimination might be somewhat different, but that sense of the outs and ins, that's the vein that both of them are mining in Latin America. So I think that the sentiment that's behind this nativist populism, and the reason I put in nativist is because immigration is a big driver of this in many countries, not all countries, but in many countries. That vein is accessible for either the left or the right. I just think that the politicians on the right have been much more active in this. And I'm also wondering if the left, because they've become kind of more removed from the debate over class than they have been in the past, that the right feels that class argument, and we're certainly seeing this even in fairly moderate democracies like Canada, and we saw what Andrew Scheer did in the last federal election, but we also saw what Boris Johnson did in the UK, where the left had gone off into its version of identity politics and other things that it was going to focus on. That's also something that leaves people who are in that non-elite category feeling like they're being left out. So I think it's a combination of those two things. There's just been more right-wing entrepreneurs. It's accessible to the left, but the left, because they've abandoned this argument over class and they've moved more into a conversation about identity and inequality related to identity, that class argument is more available to people on the right.
Yeah, Patrick, do you have a response to that? I've got a follow up on it, but what's your sense of that?
Yes. So if I look at the situation in France at the moment, what is really bizarre essentially is that the remaining left is a populist left, right? So essentially, if you take all the left-wing parties, they poll at together at 20-25%, which is insanely low. But the main candidate is Jean-Luc Mélenchon, who clearly is more of the populist type, right? And he's polling at 12.5, something like that. And even if you add the Green Party, for example, unlike the German Green Party, which seems to be quite realist, the French Green Party also has in some ways a weird populist undertone. It's not experts in some sense. So you look at the 20-25% of the left, and they're almost like left-wing populists, right? Mostly, right? And then you have the right, which are right-wing populists, and you end up with a very small percentage of politicians in the center who are the classical type of politicians you would have had like 20 years ago, and would have been like the standard center-left guy and the standard center-right guy, right? To the point where even Valérie Pécresse, who would be essentially the standard center-right candidate, tried at some point in her campaign essentially to sound populist, right? To try to capture that, okay? So the sentiment elite against the rest, if you take it in that account, it seems to be very stark. Everyone is trying to play that game in some extent, but everyone is claiming that the elites are somebody else. So essentially everyone is claiming that a different subgroup is really wielding the power essentially, and those are the people you need to fight against, right? And so that's I think, a very dangerous situation, and also very polarizing because it makes it difficult for different subgroups to negotiate, right? And to make agreements, right? So that's my sense.
Patrick, do you buy the basic argument of David Rueda, if you know it, that the conflict for the left is that there are those who are inside and those who are outside, kind of the coalition of the left, in the following sense, right? If you look at in Canada, but it would be the same in France, right? Who's done well by politics of the center left? People who are in public service positions, right? Those who are in public service related positions like teachers or university professors, right? Who benefit from the protection of the state in their industries and also benefit from very rich pensions, right? And in more corporatist environments, you can build into that large, industry companies that have industry-wide bargaining and have been able to negotiate big pensions, right? But the state gets to a place where, at least in the views of elites, it can't afford that life anymore. So you've got generations of people who have this, and young people who are kept out of it, and other people in the labor market who are kept out of that part of the equation. And for parties to the left, they have to decide, how do they square the circle of having people who actually sit at the top end of the income distribution, in the top 15% of it at least, and are well pensioned into the future and don't face the uncertainty that other people face, with their other natural constituency, which are people who are genuinely working for wages, people who are in and out of the labor market, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it seems to me that is really one of the limiting factors of the left right now, that this is not 30 or 40 years ago, where natural voting constituencies of the left are those who are moving their way up the economic ladder. It's largely those who are already now ensconced, not at the very top, but who are ensconced in very comfortable positions on the economic ladder, and they don't know how to address those at the bottom. Do you buy that basic proposition?
I think there's a lot of truth to it. I mean, if you look at polls, for example, in France, and you ask, who are the lower classes voting for? Actually, you take all these left-wing parties who are polling at 25% in total. Only 20% of the lower classes are voting for those left-wing parties. The number one party amongst the lower classes is the extreme right. It's Marine Le Pen. But even Valérie Pécresse is polling higher as all the left-wing parties together amongst the lower classes, right? Mm-hmm. Even Macron, right? And so you have this weird phenomenon where the left is speaking a lot about the lower classes, but the lower classes are not voting for the left anymore, right?
Yeah.
And so that means that whatever they're doing is actually not squaring with difficulties that the lower classes actually face. And indeed, the people who are most likely to vote for the standard left-wing parties are school teachers and university professors and so forth, right?
Yeah.
So there's something there in terms of how much you talk about the lower classes and how much you manage to reach them that is completely disconnected.
Darrell, are you seeing this more broadly?
Yeah, we definitely are. And I'll just give an example of, and I'll use a Canadian example as again, because we have a lot of Canadians on the call. The biggest supporters of Black Lives Matter and the biggest supporters of the truckers are the same people. So they are disproportionately younger, less educated, less affluent people, which is really interesting to me. So they're cross-pressured on this. What brings them together is the sense that they're being left out of what's working for people who are in power. And that's the populist element of this. And as I said before, it's accessible to both the left and the right. It's not exclusively the right. The right has just been better at identifying this group, I would say, as a political constituency and speaking to it, and in various countries than the left has been, because the left has been overtaken, as I said before, by these conversations about identity politics, which also leaves the people who are in those categories to a certain extent behind.
Can I ask you a question that we have in the chat? It comes from Paul Somerville, who, if I'm not mistaken, was an NDP candidate, but is also a former investment banker. So that's a small overlap in the Venn diagram. But Paul's just co-authored a book on populism, and his question is with Eric Plotzer, called "Reclaiming Populism." It's recommended. Eric Plotzer, sorry. And Paul's question is, his claim really is that what matters here is low social mobility. That low social mobility as a reflection of unfairness is the necessary condition for populism, and that everything else kind of amplifies the discontent. So you've got to have, another way of putting that is, you've got to have people who feel stuck where they are economically, and then all these other things, cultural grievance, conservative immigration, all piles on top of it to amplify the effect on populism. Does that resonate with you from a global perspective, Darrell? Why or why not?
Yeah, I think in certain countries it certainly does, but I would say that culture is the biggest factor in all of this. I think that what happens is we've been trained since the mid 19th century to believe that everything is reflected in terms of economic realities. So political phenomena are they're epiphenomena of economic realities. And in a lot of instances, income is not necessarily, or assets are not necessarily the way to find people who would adhere more to this populist nativist point of view. Their disagreement tends to be cultural. So particularly, I think in developed markets, you're seeing more of a cultural division than you are necessarily an economic division. I think in places like Latin America, in Eastern Europe, there definitely is more of an economic element to it. But in places like Canada or the UK or France or Italy or places of that nature, that there's this cultural element that's more dominant than anything that has specifically to do with an economic or a class explanation.
But let me just push you on this for a second, because
sure,
the answer you've just given essentially is, when I look at people's levels of income, it's not predictive of it. But that's not necessarily the argument, right? The argument could be, so I make a fine income, but it might be that I look at the society and I say, Canada today doesn't have enough social or economic mobility, not for myself, but for other people. And it's the objective level of economic mobility for everyone in the society. So it's not just my own case, but when I look out, or when I look out and I perceive it. So that's what's driving it. So let me just ask the question in a slightly different way. Do perceptions of economic mobility underwrite populism everywhere, or do you think they're not the main animating factor, not only at an individual level, but at the societal level?
Right? I think that there is a cultural element to all of this that you can't pull apart. That it's a use a good French expression, it's a bouillabaisse of all of these things. And to look at it through either an economic lens or a cultural lens doesn't necessarily reflect what's really going on. I'll give you a great example of this. Real estate in Canada, or actually real estate in any major city in the world. We could take Paris. So the likelihood that a young middle class family can find a house in downtown Paris that would be to their taste, that they could actually afford, is about the square root of 0. It's the same in downtown Toronto, which forces people to move out further all the time. Now, their parents didn't necessarily live in that kind of situation. And maybe these people who are moving out, because I hear, professors and journalists and all sorts of others writing about these things all the time with big educations, they're people who've been forced to move out. So they kind of look inside the city and they don't see like an economic elite that owns real estate, but kind of a generational elite that owns real estate that they're not entitled to. So what's that? Is that culture? Is that economics? Is that social mobility? What is it? I'm not really sure. So I think it's a really complicated, interesting discussion that is too easily succumbs to the class argument, and I don't know that it's about class.
Yeah. Well, we could draw a distinction between class and income in some sense, right? Where class is largely about your background and how you view yourself and where your social identity is,
which is my version of class.
Right.
I completely agree with that. So, when John Ebbetson and I were writing The Big Shift, it's like, okay, well, how do you describe the Laurentian elite? Is that a class? Well, yeah, kind of is.
Yes, yeah, quite apart from current income position.
Is it income driven? No. Investment bankers have more than people who are in political power.
Yeah. Patrick?
So I know of some research, in particular by Yotam Margalit. It's not published yet. So he tried essentially so here's the distinction, right? I mean, one question is whether a cause has an effect, and the other question is how big that effect is. And so he tried to make a study where he was using different types of explanations for the rise of populism and tried to see, well, which one of these explanations really is giving us the biggest aspect of the effect, right? And his result was that indeed it had something to do about notions of identity, right? And so that this was certainly playing a big role, okay? Now, the other thing that you might wonder is like, when and why do identities play such a big role, right? I mean, if you do studies on identity, the first thing you notice is that the vast majority of identities throughout human history is identities we don't know anything about anymore because they disappeared, right? So it's not like identity is something that is given fixedly, right? It's always something that is manipulated over time. And again, as someone who is French and German and Breton, which is not a thing anymore, even in my lifetime, I've seen the definition of what it means to be German actually change quite a bit, right? So there's a cultural change there just of the notion of identity, okay? So when and why do these identities get activated more strongly, right? That would be my question. And my take on that is essentially that it gets activated more strongly when you actually feel that you're not moving upward. Because at that point, you feel the need of some kind of protection, and we're social creatures, so the protection is going to be being part of a group that protects you. And it doesn't really matter that much what that group is, right? It just needs to be the fact that this group gives you some sense that you're not alone, right? And that you have means of something, a group potentially being wielding power to defend you, right? And that's less of a thing if you actually have more of a sense that, you can move upwards, right? And if there is a restriction on that, that's when these things get activated more easily, right? That would be my take. Now, if I look, for example, at France and mobility through schools, as someone whose native language, the native language of my grandparents was not French, it was Breton, right? So they were in the very western part of France. They went to school at the age of 7, they didn't speak a single word of Breton. But if you look at the history of schools in Brittany at the beginning of the 20th century, it was a way to move up. It was crazy compared to what it is today, okay? So my sense is that there are many more population at this point who actually feel stuck in a such a way that they wouldn't have, that my grandparents would have felt stuck in the same way, right? And so I tend to be essentially, I think the social mobility thing is probably more important than people think, because I think that the cultural things get activated when other fundamentals are actually not playing out in the people's lives in the way that they would expect, right? That would be my take on it.
It seems to be that the pulling them apart depends on.
Well, so the question is, why at certain point is it easier to get identities to be important to people in into playing out politically, right? It's not something that is, I mean, it's always something that is playing a role, but we have phases where it gets really important, other phases where it's much less. You know, when I was a child, it was significantly less of a thing than it is now. And my explanation would be that the identity thing is driven by some kind of fear that you cannot have, you're not having the control over your life that you actually would want to have.
Yes.
Right? And then you need to find some kind of group that protects you. You know, that's kind of and it doesn't really matter what that group is, right? Because that's manipulable much more easily than people realize.
Yes.
Yeah, but I would say that the element that pulls this together is people's opposition to the state. So it's the difference that we're seeing now. I mean, the true story of what's happening in politics right now, in my view, is not about the growth of populism on the left or the right, although I did start this by saying this is the new ideology. I do believe it. But what's happened is the collapse of the governing consensus in the middle and the deference to that governing consensus that used to exist in populations for long, has existed through most of history, particularly in developed democracies. So I think what we're seeing is that collapse of that confidence in that governing institution and the protection that you were talking about before, Patrick. So people are looking for these other things to give them a sense of belonging and to give them a sense of protection. And political entrepreneurs who are prepared to throw a match on top of that combustible material that's lying all over there are finding that their fires burn pretty brightly.
But not everywhere. So this is my final question, Darrell, right? Is
Sure.
Is it for the most part, these populist entrepreneurs of the left and right are still at the margins? In some countries they've done well, right? But we still see big parties holding on, right? The big parties are still holding on in Britain. They're holding on in Germany. They're holding on in Canada. France stands as an exception. There are other exceptions, right? So I don't want to say which is on the ascendance necessarily. But my question is, in those countries where the big parties, the parties of the broad center, are holding on, how are they doing it?
Well, I think what they're doing is they're tacking over to take advantage of some of these other opportunities. So the Boris Johnson party that ran in this in the UK the last time around, breaking through the red wall, he wasn't speaking to downtown elites at the Reform Club. He was speaking to people who were feeling disaffected in the Midlands and places like Scotland and other places. It's the same thing with even Andrew Scheer in Canada. I mean, trying to talk to union workers or whatever to take advantage of some of the things that were being stirred up that obviously the People's Party somewhat identified, but he was able to take advantage somewhat of that too. But he didn't win, obviously, but we'll see what happens in the next US presidential election. But I think what's happened is that some of these parties are moving close enough to that populist sentiment that they're at least able to bring some of those people into their coalitions. So I don't know that Cameron's party, Conservative Party in the UK, is the same identically as the one that Boris Johnson ran with. I think he took more of a populist position on Brexit, and a few other issues, and was able to win that way. Yes, he's broadly defined of a brand of a party that's existed through history, but I think the character of the party and some of the things that it pays attention to have changed. I think we're seeing the same thing in Canada right now in terms of the Conservative Party here, or even the NDP and what they decide that they want to pay attention to. In the United States, the animating elements of the American, both the American right and the American left, are more extreme than the old consensus Democrats and the old consensus Republicans in both of those places.
No, I think that's. I mean, I think the example of Boris Johnson is the telling one about a conservative who's trying to find new language about what his party ought to be for. Right. Similar things happening here in Ontario, actually, in interesting ways. Patrick, let me leave the last word to you.
That's a good one. I mean, my sense, as university professor at Sciences Po, is, we have a lot of young people who claim to care a lot about lower classes and so forth, but we don't have all that many people who actually know people from the lower classes and talk to them. And my sense is that, there used to be a time where people were more living together in some sense. And there's some sociological studies that show that even people are at work essentially are less interacting with people from different classes. And I wonder if some of the problems actually really linked to that simply, right? That somehow there's less of an ability of people talking across classes, which reinforces the sentiment that, you know, the upper classes don't understand the lower classes, right?
Yeah, I think it's actually a deeply important conversation, right? And we layer over and all sorts of questions about whether social media, for example, gives us a correct sense of what the contours of our society looks like, right? Or whether it actually amplifies our misperceptions about what the distribution of people in our society looks like. That's certainly it's actually a convicting challenge, Patrick, for someone else who's at a university and thinks about people we interact with, and for Darrell as well, I'm sure. Let me thank you all, both of you, for joining us. Thank you for those of us who joined us online and those watching this later on CPAC. And thank you very much for the questions. And Darrell, I want to thank you very much in particular for helping us put together this series and providing such a great partnership, and to Patrick and his colleagues at CEVIPOF, which is just a wonderful research institution at Sciences Po, who are really providing world-class insights on what's happening in French and in European politics. So thanks very much to both of you, and thanks to all of the audience for joining us. Cheers.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Thanks, Patrick.